Natalie Carter walked into the lecture hall, her grip on her backpack strap tightening as she stepped forward. The air was thick, not with warmth, but with something heavier, the weight of expectation, of silent judgments, of assumptions made long before she had even spoken a word. She had been in rooms like this before, places where she was expected to prove herself twice over, where people questioned her presence without saying a thing. Yet today something felt different. The hall itself was grand, designed to remind students of the challenge ahead. Rows of tiered seating stretched back endlessly. High ceilings made even the most confident feel small, and the massive chalkboard at the front stood as a silent judge of competence. Around her, students murmured in hushed tones, some exchanging glances, others scrolling absent-mindedly through their phones. But Natalie could feel it, the unspoken doubt lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. Then the door swung open, and Dr. Thomas Whitaker strode in. The energy in the room shifted instantly, silence settling like a weighted blanket. He was a man whose reputation preceded him. Brilliant, intimidating, and ruthless. A professor who prided himself on breaking students down before deciding whether they were worth rebuilding. He had done it for years, and today Natalie knew she was in his line of sight. His gaze swept over the room, pausing only when it landed on her. His lips curled, not quite into a smirk, but something close. "Miss Carter," he said, stretching her name just slightly, making it sound unfamiliar. "Let's see what you've got. Come up and solve this for us." A ripple passed through the class, soft rustling, a shifting of weight. This wasn't just an academic test. It was something more. She could hear it in the whispers. "She's going to mess it up. Let's see if she even knows where to start." The words barely registered. She knew this game too well. Closing her notebook, Natalie rose to her feet, her steps steady, measured. She would not hesitate. She would not stumble, because this wasn't about proving she knew calculus. It was about proving she belonged. Dr. Thomas Whitaker's challenge hung in the air, unspoken yet heavy with meaning. His voice had been calm, measured, but Natalie Carter knew exactly what this was. It wasn't just a test of calculus, it was a test of her. A test of whether she belonged, whether she had the right to take up space in a room like this, whether she was worth acknowledging. The whispers had already begun before she even reached the chalkboard. "She's going to mess it up. Let's see if she even knows where to start." Natalie had spent years hearing voices like those, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but always there, lingering in the background like an unwanted echo. But numbers never doubted her. Equations didn't care who she was, where she came from, or what assumptions others carried. They followed only one rule: the truth. And the truth was, she was ready for this. She picked up the chalk, her fingers steady, and made her first mark. The moment she began, the room shifted. The rustling of paper stilled, the faint tapping of a pen against a desk slowed, and eyes locked onto her. She moved with precision, her writing deliberate, her logic unfolding in a seamless stream of calculations. Step by step, the equation unraveled, not just with accuracy, but with efficiency. Dr. Whitaker's arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but Natalie could feel the weight of his scrutiny. He wasn't looking for brilliance. He was waiting for a mistake, waiting for her to falter, to confirm whatever silent expectations he had set for her. But she didn't. A sharp exhale from behind her broke the quiet. "She's actually doing it." Another voice, lower, almost begrudging. "And she's doing it fast." The chalk moved faster, her confidence growing with each line. She reached the midpoint of the problem and paused, not from hesitation but from habit. She had long since learned that people would scrutinize her every move, so she made sure there was nothing to question. Dr. Whitaker shifted on his feet. "Make sure you're not skipping important steps, Miss Carter." Natalie didn't turn around. "I'm not." The words weren't defiant, they were fact. Natalie Carter boxed her final answer, placed the chalk on the ledge, and stepped back. The lecture hall was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from boredom or disinterest, but the kind that filled a space when something undeniable had just happened. Dr. Thomas Whitaker stood still, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the board. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something more rigid, something calculating. He wasn't just checking her work, he was searching for a mistake, for anything that would allow him to reclaim control of the moment. Natalie stood with her arms crossed, waiting. Seconds stretched on. Then, finally, he let out a short breath, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "An unconventional approach," he said, his voice carefully measured, "but correct." The words landed with weight, heavier than he likely intended. An admission, even if reluctant. And then, from the back of the room, another voice rose. "That wasn't just correct," Dr. Margaret Dawson said as she stood. "That was brilliant." Her words sent another ripple through the room, one that even Whitaker couldn't control. The students, who had initially exchanged smug glances at Natalie's expense, were now leaning forward in their seats. Some whispered, others simply stared, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something else. Curiosity, respect, maybe even awe. Whitaker's fingers tapped lightly against the podium as he processed what had just happened. His authority had been challenged, and worse, he had no real way to refute it. Still, he wasn't ready to let this moment belong to Natalie, not yet. He turned back to the board, underlining part of her solution. "You chose to bypass the traditional method here," he said, tilting his head. "Tell me, Miss Carter, why did you assume this was the best approach?" It was a trap disguised as a question. He wasn't questioning her answer, he was questioning her right to think differently. But Natalie didn't flinch. "Because the traditional method introduces unnecessary steps," she replied smoothly. "This approach eliminates redundant calculations and reaches the answer faster." There was another beat of silence, then a quiet chuckle from somewhere in the room. The energy had shifted. For the first time, the students weren't looking at Dr. Whitaker. They were looking at Natalie. And in their eyes she saw something she hadn't when she first walked in: respect. It wasn't instant, it wasn't unanimous, but it was there, and it was real. She had earned it. Natalie Carter returned to her seat, her movements deliberate, measured. The moment should have ended there, but it hadn't. A shift had taken place in the room, something unspoken, yet undeniable. The students who once whispered about her were now silent, their eyes flickering between her and the board. The equation was solved, her approach flawless, but the real problem had never been about calculus. It had been about her. From the moment she stepped into the lecture hall, expectations had been placed upon her. Doubts had been whispered, silent judgments cast. They had expected her to falter, to prove them right. But she hadn't. And now, they didn't know what to do with that. Dr. Thomas Whitaker still stood at the front, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He had built his authority on control, on dictating who succeeded and who didn't. Natalie had disrupted that balance. She had shown not just intelligence, but independence, an unwillingness to follow his unspoken rules. A few seats over, a student who had previously smirked at her now hesitated before raising his hand. "Professor," he started, uncertain, "can Natalie explain how she saw that shortcut? I wouldn't have even thought to approach it that way." Natalie blinked, caught off guard. She had expected resistance, more dismissal. But this was different. Dr. Margaret Dawson, who had been watching everything unfold, nodded. "That's an excellent idea." She turned toward Natalie, her expression expectant. "Would you mind walking them through your reasoning?" For the first time that day, Natalie hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of something deeper. She had spent years proving herself, refining her skills under the weight of scrutiny, but never, not once, had anyone asked her to share how she saw the world. She glanced at the board, then back at the class. "I looked at the structure of the equation first," she said, her voice steady. Instead of working through the standard steps, I recognized a pattern that allowed me to factor out certain terms early. That simplified the problem before I even started solving. A murmur of understanding moved through the class. This wasn't a test anymore. This was something else. They weren't just seeing her. They were learning from her. As Natalie Carter slung her backpack over her shoulder, she felt the weight of something far heavier than textbooks lift from her chest. The class was over. The equations had been solved, but the real lesson hadn't been written on the board. It had unfolded in the silence, in the shifting expressions, in the way people were looking at her now. Not as an outsider, not as someone they had assumed would fail, but as someone they couldn't ignore. Dr. Thomas Whitaker remained at the front, his grip on his chalk firm, his jaw tight. He had spent years shaping the hierarchy of this classroom, reinforcing who held knowledge, who dictated success, who was worthy of respect. And today, without raising her voice, without asking for permission, Natalie had rewritten those rules. The students who had once exchanged dismissive glances were no longer looking at him. They were looking at her. One of them, a guy who had laughed earlier, now hesitated as she passed by. He rubbed the back of his neck, awkward, uncertain. "Hey," he started, "that was impressive." Natalie didn't pause, didn't slow. "I know." He blinked, then let out a small laugh, not mocking this time, but something closer to admiration. "All right then." She stepped through the door, the cool afternoon air hitting her skin, sharp and refreshing. The world outside was no different than when she had walked in. The trees still swayed lightly in the breeze. The hum of campus life continued in the distance. But she knew, in ways too subtle to explain, that something had changed. Not just in that classroom, not just in the way they saw her, in the way she saw herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a message from Alex, her best friend. "Alex, how was class?" Natalie smirked, her thumbs moving over the screen. "Natalie, same as usual, except I just made Whitaker eat his own words." The typing bubble appeared instantly. "Alex, no way, what happened?" Natalie considered how to summarize it, how to capture the moment. "Natalie, let's just say he thought he could embarrass me. He ended up embarrassing himself." A pause, then Alex's reply. "Alex, that man has been a problem for years. About time someone put him in his place." Natalie let out a short laugh. She wasn't naive. One class, one moment, wouldn't change everything. Whitaker wouldn't suddenly respect her. Some students would still doubt her. But this wasn't about them. This was about every student who would come after her, who would sit in that same chair, who would face the same doubts. Today, she had cracked something open, and that mattered. Natalie Carter stepped out of the lecture hall, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind her. The cool afternoon air hit her skin, crisp and refreshing, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the room just moments ago. She exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the last hour settle. She had done it. Not just solved the problem, not just held her ground against Dr. Whitaker. She had changed something. Inside, the classroom had been a battlefield, but not in the way most people imagined. It wasn't about numbers or formulas. It was about perception, about power, about unspoken rules that dictated who was worthy of respect and who had to fight for it. Whitaker had set a trap for her, expecting hesitation, expecting failure. The students had watched, some waiting for her to stumble, others waiting to confirm what they already believed. But instead, she had shattered their expectations. The whispers that had once carried doubt, "She's gonna mess it up," had shifted into something else entirely. "She's actually doing it, and she's doing it fast." They hadn't expected her to succeed, and they certainly hadn't expected her to do it better than anyone else in the room. Even Dr. Dawson had recognized it, standing up and declaring her work brilliant while Whitaker scrambled to maintain control. He had searched for flaws, tried to redirect the moment, but the truth had already settled in. The students weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. Natalie pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she sent a text to her best friend, Alex. "Natalie, guess who just made Whitaker choke on his own arrogance?" The typing bubble popped up immediately. "Alex, no way. Tell me everything." She considered how to summarize it, how to capture the shift in the room, the moment respect had turned in her direction. "Natalie, he thought he could put me in my place. Turns out I wasn't the one who needed to learn a lesson." Alex's reply came seconds later. "Alex, that man has been a problem for years. About time someone shut him down." Natalie smirked. She had spent years proving herself in spaces that weren't built for her. And today she had proved it again. Not just for herself, for everyone who would come after her. Life often places us in situations where we must prove ourselves, even when we shouldn't have to. Natalie Carter's story is not just about solving an equation. It's about standing firm in the face of doubt, about knowing one's worth even when others don't see it yet. For many older adults, this lesson resonates deeply. We have all, at some point, faced moments where our abilities were questioned, where we had to remind others, and sometimes even ourselves, of our value. Respect is not always given freely. Sometimes it must be earned through quiet resilience, through consistency, through refusing to shrink under pressure. Natalie didn't demand recognition. She let her work speak for itself. And in doing so, she not only changed how others saw her, but also how she saw herself. This is a reminder that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it is found in quiet confidence, in showing up prepared, in proving through action rather than words. Whether in our careers, our communities, or even in our personal lives, the ability to stand firm in who we are is one of the most powerful tools we have at any age.